Catherine sat down in front of a camera last week, and for once, the palace didn't control the weather. It controlled the lighting. It controlled the framing. It controlled the background silence. But Catherine brought something else entirely. Fear made audible, love made public, and a sentence she wasn't supposed to say. Her voice cracked halfway through the story she had practiced in private. Then she kept going anyway. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed? Perfect. Now, enjoy the video. Because something had been moving inside that family for months. Something the public could feel, but couldn't name. First came the rearrangements. An engagement shifted without explanation. Another date changed with that practiced, polite vagueness that fills air while avoiding truth. Then came the absences. A child simply wasn't there. Not for a ceremonial appearance, not for a holiday photo, not for the kind of quiet, ordinary visibility royal children usually have. The palace answered every question with the same 4 words: family privacy. As if privacy were a door that never opens from the inside. But doors open anyway. And when they do, it isn't the nation that decides what leaks out. It's what has been sealed too long. If you're new here, subscribe before we go further, because this story still has momentum, and I'm going to show you exactly why Catherine's tears weren't the headline. The headline was the mechanism behind them, the policy, the built-in silence, the decades of discipline that told everyone in that building to avoid unscripted emotion like it was a security threat, and the moment that discipline cracked, the whole country saw the shape of what was happening. My name is Harold. I spend my time tracking the records that most people never think to read. I go through the official filings, the official releases, the small contradictions that are easier to spot than they are to admit. And what I'm about to lay out is the pattern, piece by piece, until the picture becomes unavoidable. Start with the policy, because the policy is real, and it is older than anyone in the comment sections wants to believe. Around 10 years ago, William and Catherine made a decision so consistent it became invisible. They chose careful visibility over constant exposure. They planned appearances like scheduled holidays, not like celebrity calendars. George, Charlotte, and Louis, 3 children, 3 carefully managed public chapters, grew up under the logic that fewer images meant fewer predators of meaning. Think about how it looked from the outside. How often were they photographed? How often did the cameras find them unprepared? When George began his public presence, it was with guardrails. When Charlotte's school moments surfaced, they did so with consent and timing. And Louis was different. He was the quiet part of the story. The child whose face appeared less often, whose presence felt more curated, as if the palace believed protection could be measured in distance. That system did work. It worked so well that even people who mocked it often copied its instinct. They didn't call it a 10-year plan, but they lived as if it was. A decade of deliberate decisions about where the children appeared, how often, and under what terms. And almost nobody noticed that the success of the plan was part of the reason it failed later. When something works, you assume it will keep working. You stop planning for the moment it won't. But the turning point didn't start with a scandal. It started with a child asking the wrong question at the wrong time. Louis, 8 years old now, younger by royal standards and older by human standards, was kept back again. Schedules that had been set quietly stopped. An event he'd attended in previous years went on without him, and then came the kind of absence that makes even outsiders count months. Because when you watch a family like this long enough, you learn what a gap looks like. It's not just missing footage, it's a missing rhythm. The speculation grew anyway. That's the first irony. The silence was supposed to prevent stories. But silence doesn't erase curiosity. It charges it. And people began building timelines of absence, the way conspiracy theorists build maps. They weren't trying to hurt anyone. They were just trying to fill emptiness with an explanation. The press, meanwhile, tried to behave like adults. Papers like The Guardian and broadcasters like the BBC kept their coverage focused on what they could safely report. But behind their restraint, the same pressure existed. Editors need questions answered, producers need something to air, and royal policy, no matter how well designed, creates a vacuum the public will rush to fill. Then Catherine sat down. She didn't sit down with a blank script. She sat down with pages prepared by communications staff. The version cleared for release. The version that would let the palace answer without saying anything specific enough to create future questions. It was polished. It was measured. It was the palace's language, calm and official, designed to be replayed without consequence. She read it. She looked at it for a while. Then she placed it face down on the table. And without notes, without approval in the room, she spoke about her youngest son in her own words. She didn't just speak about the fact of privacy. She spoke about what privacy was doing inside the child's head. And she cried at the moment she could no longer maintain the distance between public message and private truth. 2/3 of the way through. Not at the start. Not where it would look planned. Not where it would feel like strategy. She cried while continuing. That matters. A breakdown can be edited. A continued voice can't. To understand why this was explosive, you have to understand the palace's deepest rule. Kensington does not do unscripted. Unsigned emotion is treated like a leak. It is feared because it can't be contained. And over 10 years, this family's communication strategy built its entire survival on something simple. Every sentence is sanded smooth enough to pass inspection. So why did Catherine violate the inspection? This is where the story gets personal and unsettling at the same time. Catherine wasn't only breaking protocol. She was responding to a failure that had already become visible, even if nobody could prove it. And the palace, William especially, had underestimated what the family's silence was already teaching the children. William built the wall. He built it carefully, like an engineer designing for stress fractures. He argued for silence. He defended it for years against inside-house voices, telling him it would backfire. Backfire is the word people use when they mean create headlines. But the real risk William feared wasn't headlines. He feared the nation's hunger for meaning, the way public life turns people into content and turns families into interpretations. He learned this lesson early. He learned it from the public treatment of Diana, from the way personal details became commodities, from the way private grief became national theatre. William watched a child being turned into a narrative the country thought it owned, and the decade after that taught him a rule that became his instinct: never let the world get the specific. So he withheld. He controlled access. He created boundaries so tight that almost nobody noticed they existed, and for years the strategy produced something close to success. George, in particular, learned how to live with the absence. As he grew older, he became almost too composed. 13 is old enough to understand something is wrong, old enough to sense fear without being told the reason for it, and young enough to think the responsibility might be his. So George made himself calm. He became quieter. He became careful. He became useful in the way anxious children do, by absorbing adult tension so adults don't have to carry it in front of him. Charlotte, meanwhile, detected the closed doors. 11 is old enough to notice patterns. 11 is old enough to understand when adults lower their voices without knowing why. She noticed who walked in and who walked out. She noticed the way conversations stopped when she entered. And she noticed something nobody in the palace predicted. She started leaving handmade jokes, not once, not accidentally, regularly, by the bed. She timed it to laughter, because she had worked out on her own that when Louis laughed, he came back for a minute. She produced that moment in pencil because she learned the hard way that adults weren't offering relief. And then Charlotte asked her mother the question children should never have to ask. Are strangers worried about him? And then, darker, more precise, is he going to have to answer them? That's what long strain does. It turns a protected child into the person who carries adult fear. It teaches him his absence needs explanation, even when adults won't give one. It turns silence into a story. And the story Louis wrote for himself was cruel in its simplicity. Catherine later described it in her own words. Louis began to believe he was kept out of sight because the family was ashamed of him. Not because he was ill, not because anything had been wrong in the official language, because the silence had a meaning inside a child's mind. And children don't interpret absence as protocol, they interpret it as rejection, because rejection is the first logic their brains offer when adults refuse to answer. William heard that explanation after it already had roots inside his household. He didn't hear it because advisors presented it. He heard it because a child had spoken truth in the private way children do, at the moment adults weren't ready for. That moment happened earlier in the year, at Windsor, during a private rehearsal. The plan was simple: rehearse without cameras, without crowds, without the world practicing a new angle on a boy's body and face. Louis was meant to practice how to stand and where to walk, without the nation learning a template. Halfway through, Louis stopped and reached for Catherine's hand. Then he asked a question that should have ended the entire debate instantly. He didn't ask if he wanted to be seen. He asked if he was allowed. Allowed. Not invited. Allowed. If you're listening for the political angle, here it is. William's silence wasn't only a tactic, it was a policy with psychological consequences, and Louis felt those consequences like a rule written on his skin. Catherine knelt down. She took both his hands, and she searched for words that would be both true and reassuring. She later told at least 2 people this wasn't easy, because truth can be terrifying when you're 8, and the adults in the room won't tell you why they're afraid. William cleared the room. He removed George and Charlotte from the immediate space, because he didn't want the eldest and the youngest forced to watch the brother ask what so many parents fear their children will ask. Then William did what he always did when control threatened to slip. He shut everything down. Engagements involving Louis were suspended immediately, and William made it clear he wasn't interested in discussing it. Not to the press, not to inside advisors, not even to the kind of questions that might become legitimate if repeated. One missed ceremony, he argued, mattered less than everything next to a child beginning to think he was being kept away for a reason that had nothing to do with his safety. That instinct was understandable. It was also, in the cruel mathematics of children, incomplete. Because when adults refuse to explain, the child explains anyway, and in this case, the child explained by blaming himself. At that point, advisors urged a controlled explanation. The reasoning wasn't cynical. They weren't trying to sell a narrative. They were trying to prevent chaos. They'd seen this shape before. They'd seen how silence in 2024, when Catherine faced a gap in her public schedule and refused to be detailed, created speculation that spread beyond anything predicted. Advisors told William the absence wouldn't stay empty. Someone would fill it. And he wouldn't get to choose who that someone would be. William refused. For months he refused. He insisted Louis's situation needed to remain private, while the child was still uncertain and frightened. But the family's silence had already spread. It wasn't contained. It leaked into George's calm, Charlotte's coded humor, and Louis' growing fear that he was the one who made adult conversations stop. And the longer the wall stayed standing, the more it became not protection, but pressure. It came apart in a night conversation after the children were asleep. Catherine wrote her own statement by hand, not a polished draft only. Her version, written slowly, revised through several sittings, and set on the table beside the palace's approved draft. A palace-approved statement is a specific kind of document, its language cleared in advance. It's a skilled performance, designed to admit something without creating anything new to be questioned later. It is written to be unfalsifiable. It avoids claims that could turn into contradictions. It turns fear into abstraction. To Catherine, that draft read like a refusal to say the real thing. It described a situation improving without admitting what had been endured. It mentioned progress while erasing the panic. It didn't lie exactly. It simply left out the parts that would make sense to a child listening from the inside. William read her opening line and shook his head before the second. Then he told her that even one public message could be replayed, analyzed, and quoted back at Louis for the rest of his life. He asked whether she was ready to watch their son's inner world become national debate without his consent. Catherine didn't back off. She pushed the official draft away and told William the truth in plain terms. Louis had begun to believe he was being kept out of sight because the family was ashamed of him, not because he was sick, not because it was a medical story, because he had worked it out at 8, because the conversations changed when he entered a room, and he concluded he was the reason adults spoke differently. Then she added the detail that made William's resistance feel suddenly small. George lowered his voice whenever Louis's name came up. Charlotte left jokes beside Louis's bed because she understood laughter made him return. Adults were protecting, but the child was absorbing the protection as guilt. And then Catherine told William something that didn't come from her at all. Louis had made a request unprompted. He wanted to thank the people who had made him feel safe. He wanted George and Charlotte to know what their behavior had mattered, and he didn't want the country thinking he had disappeared because he wasn't brave enough. That last sentence landed because it turned the public story upside down. Instead of hidden child, it became hidden strength. Louis wasn't being interpreted as fragile. He wanted to be interpreted as recovering. William sat down. He put his hands over his face for a moment. Then he admitted something the palace had trained him not to say. His decisions weren't only about privacy. They were about his own fear of losing control of what happens to the people he loves. Control. That word explains every silence since 1997. Here is the most important pivot. They reached a boundary together that night. Catherine would speak, but the private details would stay private. And William would stop pretending the last months had been easy. Because pretending wasn't protection anymore. Pretending was making the child's mind fill the gaps with fear. The next step belonged to Charles. Charles received Catherine's draft after an evening briefing. He cleared the room, read the pages twice, and removed the glasses slowly, like a man taking off armor. When he reached the line about privacy being mistaken for shame, he didn't argue with Catherine's emotion. He understood it at a level the others often missed. Because Charles had lived inside the same argument with the same institution. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced Charles had been diagnosed with cancer. The following years forced him to negotiate what the public deserved and what the private self needed to remain whole. The question for him wasn't only, how much should we tell? It was, what does withholding cost? Charles asked William one question. Did the statement serve Louis, or did it serve the adults around him? That question was brutal because it was correct. Families tell themselves they protect the child. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes protection becomes self-defense, and the child absorbs the gap instantly. William defended Catherine's judgment. He also admitted the concern he'd held from the beginning. Once a recording exists, the family loses control. Reporters will search the absences. They will review decisions and find what was omitted. Some of it will be discovered. He was right, and the discovered piece became the story faster than anyone expected. One communications detail decided the battle. The palace's safer version was shorter, calmer, and it removed the part where Louis thanked the people who had helped him. The professional sentence replaced the child's voice. Charles rejected that change. According to someone who saw the exchange, his reasoning was simple. A statement stripped of the boy's meaning would protect the institution while failing the person standing in the middle of the story. It was the trade the monarchy had spent a century making badly. Charles approved Catherine's version with one condition. Louis had to hear every word before release. Not a summary, not a gist, the whole thing. Read aloud, so he could understand precisely what the country would be told about his own life. He would also have a chance to say no. An 8-year-old allowed to veto the framing of his own recovery. Catherine read him the final version in private. He listened with seriousness she hadn't seen before, and then he corrected exactly one phrase. She had written that he was doing better. He didn't want that. He wanted people to know he was getting strong again. Doing better is something that happens to you. Getting strong again is something you do. The difference wasn't vocabulary, it was agency. It was how a child reclaimed ownership over his own story when adults had tried to write it for him. Charles approved the revised wording and added a note in his own handwriting. Truth delivered with restraint, he wrote, can protect the crown more honestly than silence. That note is the hinge of the entire episode. It reverses something the institution has believed since before these people were born. The default has always been that saying nothing is the safe option. This time, the safe option was the dangerous one. Catherine spoke calmly. She thanked those who had looked after her son. She said his strength was coming back. And then, 2/3 of the way through, she cried. The palace didn't cut it out. It didn't replace her with a cleaner take. It let the emotion exist inside the message, like proof of sincerity. The response was immediate, bigger than the advisors had prepared for. Phones started ringing. Headlines built within hours. Messages arrived at the palace faster than staff could process them. Then the coverage turned, exactly where William had feared it would turn. Broadcasters began building timelines. In graphics departments across the country, somebody pulled up every Louis appearance from the previous 18 months and laid it against dates where he hadn't appeared. People called it context. Reporters called it pattern analysis. Fans called it the truth finally showing. Presenters started saying, in recent months, with the particular tone that signals, we are about to speculate. And once speculation gets oxygen, the palace can't breathe it out again. One commentator did something that ended William's control completely. He reviewed footage taken before the crisis began. Ordinary footage, family walking somewhere. He paused it on Louis's face and began describing what an 8-year-old likely felt at a time the public never knew was even relevant. Frame by frame. William watched. Then he stood abruptly. His hand rose toward the television as if he could stop the words mid-air. Then he found the remote and turned the TV off. In that room, he told a small group of staff only one line. My son is not entertainment. Those 5 words were not official, not cleared, not written, but they carried the weight of a man who had spent 30 years building a wall around his children. And now he was watching a stranger narrate an 8-year-old's expression to millions. Outside, the story became cultural instead of merely political. Families began leaving handwritten blue stars outside Windsor Castle, paper and cardboard. The messages repeated the phrase Louis had chosen for himself, getting strong again. They multiplied over about 4 days. Most weren't even addressed to Louis directly. They were addressed to someone else, inside the nation's memory. A child in hospital in Leeds, a grandparent recovering, a daughter having a difficult year. People came to Windsor to leave a message for a prince and ended up leaving one for their own child. That matters because the country has a complicated history with leaving things at royal gates. The last time this happened on this scale, the flowers outside Kensington went deeply, and the message beneath them was accusation. People stood at gates and told a family it had done harm, and that harm had been national. 29 years later, the paper stars didn't accuse, they comforted. Nobody planned the symmetry, but William would have noticed it. William, of all people, understands what patterns mean in public life. At least one newspaper ran Catherine's image across its front page, under 3 words. A mother's voice. Beneath it, smaller type repeated Louis's phrase, as if the nation needed confirmation that the child's agency had been real. Not everyone agreed. Commentators demanded explanations. Why now? Why months of silence? Why weren't earlier absences clarified sooner? Some argued that public-facing monarchy can't decide unilaterally which parts of its working life are private. Palace officials answered with the hardest version of the argument. A child's situation, they said, is not public property. The family had said enough to acknowledge what happened, without handing over every detail of it. Then, when speculation intensified around one sentence, an explanation about where fear had been headed, the advisors recommended another clarification. Close the gap before it becomes a rumor with a life of its own. Catherine refused. She said that explaining every frightening detail would destroy the exact privacy the family had protected for months. She hadn't come through this process to end up doing the thing she had refused to do at the start. And that was the moment she won. She proved she could speak. Now she proved she could stop. But the episode cost them something in plain political terms. The family gave up something they had protected for more than a decade. Once a parent speaks in their own voice, future silence gets measured against that breakthrough. William spent the year handing the press a precedent he spent 10 years refusing to provide. Against that loss, they got one outcome the nation couldn't ignore. An 8-year-old stopped believing he was ashamed of himself. People can argue whether that trade was worth it. Some say Louis would have recovered anyway. Some say the time spent protecting him could have helped without turning the situation into the kind of national spectacle that makes children feel like objects. That criticism isn't stupid. It might even be correct. But then came the second turning point. And it wasn't televised. It happened in a garden room on the floor. A few days after the recording went out, William went looking for his son and found him sitting alone. No staff, no siblings, no professional adults arranging comfort like a public event. Just a boy, waiting in a quiet room. A chair sat nearby. William ignored it. He sat on the floor, level with Louis, because for once, hierarchy couldn't be allowed to control the conversation. Then William asked one question. How do you feel now that people know? Louis thought for a while. And then he didn't talk about cameras. He didn't talk about headlines. He talked about William. He noticed something William hadn't realized he was doing. He said he noticed his father stop talking about royal events when he entered the room. Follow what that means. Before the crisis, royal engagements were exciting to an 8-year-old. His father traveling meant story time. His father's work meant helicopters and energy and important days. Then, over months, that conversation vanished the moment Louis walked in. William had done it deliberately to reduce pressure. But silence communicates pressure anyway, and the child interpreted it as exclusion. He concluded that adults had decided he would never be strong enough to attend one again. William removed the pressure by changing the topic. The boy absorbed exclusion by changing his own story. And then Louis said the words that broke everything open. He confessed something his father didn't even know the child had heard. I heard you crying. 4 words. On a floor. In a garden room. From an 8-year-old to the future King of England. During the worst week of the crisis, Louis had been awake outside his father's bedroom door. He heard William crying, and Louis pretended to be asleep because at 8, he couldn't work out what a child is supposed to do with a crying adult who believes he is alone. Pretending seemed kinder than letting William know he'd been overheard. That confession contained 2 devastations at once. The first, William, trained since birth to hold his face steady for the public, crying in his own house like a man who no longer could. Alone, late, unseen. The second, Louis, doing the arithmetic of adult protection, deciding whether telling his father would help or worsen it, choosing the option he believed would protect the adult. It was care, pure care. But it was also the tragedy of silence, how children protect adults because they've learned adults can't handle truth. William held his son and told him that being brave never means not being afraid. It means saying the thing when staying quiet would be easier. That sentence echoed Catherine's message, but now it arrived from the person the boy had been trying to shield. Then Louis made a decision. Not a PR strategy, a human decision. He wanted to go back gradually. No grand ceremony, no scheduled route, no rehearsals that turned the recovery into choreography. A small step, a way for his siblings to stand beside him without pressure from crowds. And Catherine came in after it was finished. She saw William's face. She looked at her son. Something had shifted permanently in that home. They agreed on the spot. No statement. No arranged appearance. No pressure until Louis said he was ready himself. Louis said it in the summer. On August 1, 2026, William and Catherine took all 3 children to the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. And here is the crucial detail. It wasn't staged like a royal delivery. It wasn't announced like a spectacle. They attended as a family. The couple's titles in Scotland were present in the background, but the behavior wasn't ceremonial in the usual way. They watched sport like thousands of other people. Netball, cycling, and a moment that went around the world within hours. A Welsh cycling bucket hat too big for him, a fist bump with the mascot, a boy existing in public without having to justify himself. The country figured it out on its own, because the family had returned to visibility without the language of performance. George is 13, Charlotte is 11, Louis is 8. And when they arrived, Louis stopped. Charlotte took one of his hands. George took the other. Catherine didn't push him forward. She didn't hide the pause. She waited until he chose the moment. Then they went in together. William watched and finally understood what had taken him months to realize. Getting back to normal could never mean rebuilding what existed before. It meant building a different arrangement. He had measured privacy by how much the family withheld. The lesson from 1997 had taught him withholding prevented the world from owning the specific, but the truth that arrived later was harder. Silence can keep a child safe physically and still leave him completely alone inside it. Both can be true. Catherine learned the reverse. Honesty could pull Louis out of the shame story, but honesty couldn't become permission to dump every detail of a child's recovery into the public market. She used the personal recorded statement instead of an endless press release cycle because it let her tell the truth and then stop. Charles later said something privately that may end up being the most quoted line if it ever becomes confirmed. He believed the monarchy hadn't been weakened. He believed it had come out stronger for surviving something hard without turning the hard part into performance. Dignity and emotional honesty, he implied, don't have to fight. Louis didn't ask whether he would be allowed to go to another event. He asked when he could come back. That question tells you everything you need to know about the outcome. A child assuming there will be a next time. A child planning forward. A child rewriting his future. On the wall of Windsor, Catherine was later sent photos of the blue stars left outside. She went through them and kept one message. Not the message with the biggest audience. The message written by another child. She asked quietly that it be preserved for Louis rather than cleared away. William received a letter too, a father who had survived his own version of this, explaining difficult truth to children who were too young for the full answer and too old to be dismissed. And that letter hit William differently because it was the same theme, turned outward. The palace's choices had reached beyond the gates, beyond Windsor, beyond headlines. They reached the human places families live. Louis kept one star beside his bed. The message on it said he was brave even when he was resting. The palace answered all of it with restraint, which is the correct response. No campaign, no commemorative photo run, no rushed return, no interviews to capitalize on sympathy. Because none of Catherine's actions were rebellion. None were publicity. They were correction. The palace's system had been designed to avoid harm. It simply had to learn that harm can happen through silence as well. So what should we ask now? Because this story isn't finished just because the camera went quiet. What happens the next time a child's fear asks a question that adults can't properly translate into policy language? And what happens when the public, once invited into the emotional timeline, demands entry into every private chapter that follows? Finally, when William and Catherine have proven they can speak, will they also prove they can stop before fear turns truth into another performance? Stay tuned, hit like, subscribe, and come back, because this family is going to keep testing the edge of what the country thinks it deserves and what a child actually needs.